welcome to Get Geeked, presented by Barnes& and Noble. I am here with Justin A. Reynolds. He's the author of Miles Morales Shockwaves, Miles Morales Stranger Tides, among other YA and young reader titles. Justin, welcome.
Hey, thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Of course, thanks for being here. So, we want to start with just hearing out what your connection to Spider-Man was when you first met him, what your first impressions were, just as a fan. So, if you want to talk about that.
Yeah, so I met the Peter Parker Spider-Man as a kid. My mom used to take us to uh, this flea market, and they had a comics booth. And in order to get us to make sure we were in our best behavior, my sister and I, she would tell us that if we were good, at the end of the day, we'd be able to go to the comics booth. So that was kind of my first exposure. And then once we got there, they had like these mystery bags that you could buy for like $2, and you didn't know which comics were in them. So we'd spend our money on those bags, and oftentimes they'd be stuff like Jughead, or like the Archie series, but then there'd be a lot of Spider-Man and X-Men. And so that was kind of my first exposure to Spider-Man. And I loved him from the start. I thought he was completely relatable. You know, he's a younger superhero who is juggling the responsibilities of a family life, trying to be true to his relatives, and make sure that they're safe and okay, trying to be a good friend, trying to do well at school, has dreams of being a photographer. So all those things kind of related to where I found myself at that period of time.
I love that. So was it, you mentioned Spider-Man, X-Men. Were there other stories at that time that were drawing you in? And was Spider-Man always kind of the top of the pyramid for you?
So Spider-Man's always been my favorite overall superhero. I did go through a period where, for inexplicable reasons, I really loved Gambit. Like Gambit was my favorite X-Men. I know everybody else around me at that time was like big into Wolverine, of course. But like Gambit, I don't know, man. I don't know if it was the accent. I don't know what it was, or he got to hang out with Rogue. I'm not sure, but he was always my favorite.
It's funny because for I always had this weird vendetta against Spider-Man that I could never explain. And it was actually Miles Morales and reading your stuff and seeing the movies that made me realize, oh, maybe I misjudged Spider-Man. Maybe there's more here than I thought. So thank you for that because it opened my eyes to how great Spider-Man is. We'll get more to Miles Morales here in a second. But were there any particular you know, moments in the Spider-Man universe, or like you mentioned, sort of his everyday life and how that attracted you, but like moments of his heroism where you're like, ah, yes, like this is the guy.
I think that there were a few of those moments. I feel like what really kind of did it for me in terms of Spider-Man as the story progressed, because the story obviously has been going on for a very long time at this point, and it's been through the hands of a lot of different writers. And so we've kind of seen different versions of Spider-Man, and they've all been great in their own ways. I think to me, like what really drew me to Spider-Man was those moments in which, like, as a superhero, they're always kind of risking their lives, right? But it felt like Spider-Man, who was mostly on his own, whose powers always seemed to be um, kind of not overmatched, but like he had to be at the height of his powers in order to defeat the type of villains that he was going against. Uh, and he did so with like flair and comedy. And I just thought, I mean, I don't know if I would want to be Spider Man's friend because he's so snarky. Um, but I do think that just as a superhero, I think just those moments where like you knew where he knew it was either going to be like him coming out alive and coming out on top, or the other guy. But especially when it involved like his aunt or Mary Jane, like I feel like those moments in which like real life filtered into the equation, and the odds weren't just about him and he was going to make it out, but he was more concerned about the people that he loved most. I think those are the elements that have always spoken to me most directly.
Mm. I like that. Yeah, my switching moment for Spider-Man was when I accepted the fact that he never asked to be a hero. He just kind of it happened to him and then he did it, but he didn't lose himself. Like for reasons unknown, I always liked Iron Man because I was like, oh, he built
Mm.
himself. But I'm like, yeah, but he had the wealth to do it. Like
Yeah, yeah,
so
yeah.
Spider-Man won me over with that whole didn't choose to be a hero, became one anyway, and never lost his core humanity, which I think is just like so important for everyone.
No, that's awesome. I feel like that, I agree with that. I think like I talk to a lot of kids about Spider-Man and about the Marvel universe, and I'm like, you think about it, like there's nothing preventing him from turning to the other side.
Mhm.
There are very few people on the planet that could stop him if he chose to go that way, and especially Miles Morales, who has even upgraded powers and abilities that Peter Parker never had. It's like who could stop him? And I know we're going to talk about it a little bit later, but it's like when I was writing Miles Morales, there'd be times where I found it challenging to create big enough obstacles for him to tackle that weren't easily within the realm of his powers that he could just simply overcome. And so, yeah, that's what's remarkable to me too, is that it would be easy for him to turn to the other side or even just simply ignore what's going on in the world. Like he's a kid. You know, there's no reason that he has to be involved because he has these powers. But he has always accepted that it comes with that responsibility. And he's always taking on the challenge, you know, regardless. I was thinking about like I always like the matches that he had with like Craven. There's like a few different people who I really enjoy seeing him go up against because he would have to be at the top of his game. But somehow, even when it always seemed like he was like down and out, he found a way. And I think that just speaks to the will that it takes to decide to be a superhero versus allowing yourself to kind of fall into doing it.
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned like how he's still just a kid because I think that's another thing that I love about not just what you've done with Miles Morales, but just these comics that are geared towards kids in general is showing them relatable heroes and stuff that they can associate with. And since you brought up Miles Morales, like let's segue into when you first met this version of Spider-Man and how you felt about him compared to the Peter Parker version, all that good stuff.
Yeah, so I think a lot of people their first exposure to Miles Morales. Some people tell me that it was Shockwaves. I know for a lot of people it was the first original movie, Into the Spider Verse, and so I think um, for a lot of people that's kind of where the genesis was. For me, it started probably a decade earlier with the intro of him, and I was a big fan of Spider Man. Like I said, Peter Parker, and so then here comes this kid, Miles Morales, who has like a similar ancestry to myself and who also has these additional powers. And it's kind of like an updated Spider-Man for our time. What's cool to me is that I never thought about it that way because I grew up with Peter Parker. And so to me, it was just like, oh, it's awesome to have this other Spider-Man introduced into the Marvel canon. But for so many kids I talk to, like this is their Spider-Man. Like they don't know much about Peter Parker. Like this is the Spider-Man that they know and love, whether it be because of the cartoon of the animated movies or if it's because of the comics or the books or graphic novels. I think it's pretty cool to see someone that kind of speaks to this current generation.
Mm. Yeah, that's so important, and I'm glad you brought that up. So when did you get the call that this was going to be your next creative project, and what were sort of your initial thoughts or plans or initial, yeah, just takeaways from that, call?
Yeah, so it's interesting. Every year, myself, along with my agent, have kind of a State of the Union call in which we kind of talk about like where I'm at in terms of my career, short-term goals I have, long-term goals. And I had just this was in 20 early 2020, very early 2020. So I had Opposite out for about a year. And Opposite of Always, my debut book, a young adult title, had performed pretty well. And there were people who were kind of asking me to take on other projects based on that. And so I had just told my agent for a long term goal, which in this case, I was thinking like sometime like within the next 5 to 6 years, I wanted to try to write something for Marvel. And honestly, I'd be lying to you if I told you that I ever thought I would ever be able to write Miles Morales. Of course, he'd be at the top of my list just because of my personal attachment. But you know that is such a huge piece of the Marvel world right now that you know it would have been like beyond my wildest dreams. And then one day my agent is like texting me and she's like, let's jump on a call. And I'm like, okay, right. She normally doesn't just ask me to jump on calls in the middle of the day. So like, what's going on? And then she's like, yeah, Marvel came calling. They had, someone had read Opposite of Always. They really liked the voice. They thought the voice, and kind of the trials and tribulations that the main character, Jack King, in that book goes through, kind of had some echoes to what Miles Morales was going through. And so they asked if I would be willing to take a crack at it and if I had any ideas, that could be kind of kicking off this graphic novel series that they were kind of investigating. So yeah, that was the call. I was shocked, but obviously very pleased that they thought of it.
So you mentioned like this was unexpected, but it was like the peak of the goal. Had you ever considered or maybe even dabbled in writing just like fan fiction of Miles Morales before? Like had you tried that out, or was this like this is like the first time for it?
I'll be honest, like I had not attempted any Miles fan fiction at all. But like growing up, I always dabbled in comics, like writing comics, making up comics. Me and one of my good friends from school, we used to like in math class pass back and forth. Uh, this comic that we were working on that we share with a lot of our classmates, and they kind of loved it. And we did like installments, and so kind of nerded out in that way. And so it was always kind of a dream to be able to do something like this. It's harder. You think about what it would take to try to launch your own comic series is tough. And so the idea that Marvel, which is like, the juggernaut of that world, would come calling and then allow me to do one of the most precious commodities in Miles Morales and one of the most popular commodities was amazing. And so yeah, I don't think there's anything that can truly prepare you for that task. And even as I was accepting it, I'd be lying if I didn't say I was a little bit nervous to make sure that I lived up to that legacy.
So they asked you if you had any ideas. Did you like have a bunch of ideas or a bunch, or was it just like this is the idea and they were like, yeah, sounds great?
So, uh, as fate would have it, when they asked me if I had any ideas, there had just been a series of devastating earthquakes in Puerto Rico. And instantly, I thought about how Miles and his family would deal with that tragedy because his mother is of Puerto Rican descent, and so having grown up on that island and still having family and friends there, that would greatly impact their family. And I thought, what else? What better way to also introduce Miles to new young readers than to also give him a foe or an enemy that he actually can't defeat. Like he can't undo the toll of an earthquake, no matter how strong he is, no matter how capable he is, right? And so I wanted to teach the lesson too that like sometimes the odds truly are stacked against you in a way in which you're like, just me on my own strength, I don't know how I can overcome this one thing. But together with people in the community and the help of his mom and his dad and his friends, he's able to devise a plan to kind of help improve just a little bit the quality of life for those in Puerto Rico who were affected by earthquakes. And so it becomes a story of about trying to help a people rebuild. And um, I thought that it was fitting because it's like I said, even though he does have an enemy that he does fight physically in that story, the true enemy is really that kind of causes all this whole thing is those devastating earthquakes, which are obviously very real and very much impact people's lives.
I don't want to sound like a broken record. I keep wanting to say, "Oh, I love that," because I do. I don't like what you're saying, but that's odd. Like instilling that message, making this meaningful beyond just the surface value story level. That's excellent. So you that idea gets done. You're ready to go. How did you start? Like, especially thinking from the point of view of, okay, you're writing a character who already exists out there. So how was it that you approached sort of making him yours while still staying true to what he already was?
Yeah, so I tried to as easy as it would have been to get caught up in the idea of like, wow, there's this tremendous foundation and legacy in place, rather than kind of like be uh, kind of paralyzed by that. I tried to embrace it because it's something that I loved and I already knew well. And because I already knew the story of Miles Morales and he wasn't, this random character coming into my life, I already thought about like the impact that he had on me already and how I could share that with young readers. And it's interesting because, like I said, the reason why I was drawn to Spider-Man in the first place was because of all the kind of things he's juggling in his everyday life. And yet he chooses time and time again to show up in that suit and to save and protect the people in his community. And that's honestly what really draws me to him maybe the most is that most of the time when we talk about superheroes, they're trying to save the entire world, which is obviously important and noble in its own right and it's complicated. But I think what I really love is that Spider-Man is known as your friendly neighborhood spider, right? There's Spider-Man in Queens, Spider-Man in Brooklyn, Miles is in Brooklyn. And it's this idea that first and foremost, he's engaged with his community on that level. So he's worried about the people that are around him, the people he's grown up with, the people at the corner store, people in his building, right? The people he sees up and down, going up and down the elevator, the people at school. But those are the people that he is thinking about when he's thinking about how can I make the world a little bit safer? How can I make sure that the people who are trying to do the right thing have a clear path to get there? And so that's what really kind of drew me in to Spider-Man and what really pushed me to try to push Spider-Man to face a test that would be almost greater than any test he's ever really faced.
I'm always curious when creators get the opportunity to write into an IP like this. Like, and I've heard such a wide array of like the rules they had to follow. Like, were there, and you don't have to get into too much detail if you can't, but were there things that Marvel said like these are your boundaries, you cannot, there are certain things you cannot do, or did you kind of have free reign to do what you wanted?
So like I've heard stories, not necessarily just about Marvel, but just in general about IP and especially like very like prized IP being difficult to write because they're they not only want you to kind of invest like your storytelling into the character, but also there's a legacy and there are people who have the readers have expectations that when they open up a Miles Morales book, this is how it's going to feel. This is how it's going to be, right? And so you have to, in a way, write to your fans and write for your fans of that IP. And so that's something to consider. But in terms of like rules and regulations, I'll say like Marvel really let me just kind of take the ball and run with it. I was very pleasantly surprised. I kept waiting for them to kind of like pull me back and try to rein me in and I remember like I had several pinch me moments throughout the process. Like, wow, I get to create when they suggested that I created the two kind of main villains that Spider-Man deals with in Shockwave. And I was like, from scratch, like from my own head, I get to just create two new villains that get to be in the Marvel world forever. And they're like, yeah, that's what we want you to do. And I was like, I can't believe this. And so I'm like, nah, I'm dreaming them up and I'm trying to like, I remember like trying to write the like descriptions and trying to think about backstory for them and then how it impact Miles' story and how like, there actually happen to be two young teenagers as well who are finding themselves kind of on the other side as Miles is kind of finding his way and learning the superhero ropes, these two kind of villains would be what villains are also trying to figure out how to be villains and how to be great at what they want to do, right? And so it was interesting to kind of show uh, that contrast between those two different paths, but also to have like full autonomy over the two new characters that I was developing. And so, yeah, it was amazing. I remember the first time when I saw them drawn by the artist, Papa Leone. I was just like, "What? This is wild! Like this came straight up in my head." And he took it and ran with it and made it even better. And so, yeah, it was the whole process. While definitely intense. I mean, especially in terms of speed and being able to like crank out a script because that's essentially what you're writing is a script and all the responsibilities that the writer has in those projects, which I didn't know because I'd never done anything like this. It's one thing to do like IP and do like a work of prose, which is in my field house, my wheelhouse. That's what I've always kind of done. Versus like, okay, here we want you to try a graphic novel for the first time, and it's going to be Spider-Man, by the way. And it's Miles Morales. So it's like, oh, okay, all right. I guess I could take a stab at it. I'll do my best here. So it definitely had the potential to be intimidating, but everyone at Marvel and also at Scholastic really made the process so much fun and so enjoyable, and they really let me kind of sink my teeth into it and leave my own mark. And fortunately, Shockwave did really well, and people seem to really enjoy it. So it was a kind of an awesome start to this graphic novel series that they wanted to begin with.
Uh, I had a whole section for villains, so I'm glad that you brought up that you got to create two villains. So I want to start with, did before all of this, did you have any favorite villains either in the Spider-Verse or elsewhere?
And that's a good question. I'm trying to think. Like I mentioned Craven earlier. I'm trying to think. I The thing about me is that I tend to not be drawn to straight up villains or superheroes. I tend to kind of like characters who like live kind of in that ambiguous, morally gray period where it's like I don't say they're mercenaries, but they're kind of like depending on the situation, it kind of dictates how they perform. And like I see there's like quite a few kind of quote unquote bad guys who, when it's come down to it, have also made themselves of service to things that protected people or even save people. And so those tend to be kind of the characters that I like the most, who can't be kind of fit into a box. I think that I'm trying to think of. I mean, Green Goblin has always been a big foe of Spider-Man. I think I thought about using Green Goblin at the beginning for a long period of time. He was kind of the character I was kind of thinking about because I thought this is kind of a cool way to kind of hand this torch over to Miles and to say like, here's one of Peter Parker's greatest nemesis, and now here you have at it. And I just kind of like the backstory and kind of the personal connection. But I realized that that wasn't necessarily there for Miles, right? He didn't necessarily have that personal connection, and so I wanted to create people who he could identify with and who he could kind of um, look to on his journey to becoming the superhero that he wanted to be as kind of like, you know, foundational marks in that journey.
And then in regards to the two sort of villain-ish characters that you created in this, were you drawing from anything in particular, like anything within that universe already, or just sort of creating from scratch, building what you wanted them to be?
Yeah, I just kind of did it from scratch mostly. I knew I wanted them to be like really kind of I'm not sure if I'm allowed to say words out, but bad A, and so like I really wanted them to be, um to be really tough. I wanted them to uh, be a formidable match for Miles. I didn't want to have it where it's like, that at the end of the day, Spider-Man is going to be easily able to put them away. I wanted it to be like where their powers um, complemented each other so well, but they also were in like a direct conflict for Spider-Man, where it's like, oh, how do I defend against this? How do I defend against that? And so both of their powers combined, it was like it was more than just a match for Spider-Man. It really put him on the brink of losing. And in fact, in the beginning, his first entanglement with them doesn't go well, and he has to learn from that lesson. And so, yeah, I think it was. I think I kind of drew just from lots of years of reading comics in terms of kind of creating their history. But I knew I wanted them to be young and I wanted them to identify with Miles. A lot of times some of the characters, especially the bad guys that Miles has had to fight, they kind of look at him with skepticism because they're like, you're a kid, right? Like you don't belong here. And so I wanted to have two other people who wouldn't even care about that, right? Their thing was like, Spider-Man is standing in the way between us and our goals, and we're not going to allow that to happen. And then Spider-Man, Miles Morales, is like, you know, I'm still growing as a superhero. I'm still learning how to be one. And so you see him along the way make some mistakes that a seasoned superhero wouldn't make. But then you also get to see him kind of like swing back and learn from those things and really grow and come into his own as a superhero rather than just be kind of what everyone expects a superhero to be.
Mm. And then in terms of like getting into the voices of the characters, do you feel like there's a craft difference between writing a character again like Miles Morales, who he kind of has that voice, he has that snark, you're fitting your voice into it versus characters who you create their voice from nothing. Do you have does it feel the same writing to both of them?
Yeah, I think writing Miles Morales and writing Spider-Man, I feel like, Miles Morales obviously has his own voice for sure and has his own uh there's a way if you read those comics, it's like it's clear that he is kind of a spawn of Peter Parker, Spider-Man, right? Because he kind of has the same wit, the same charm that Peter Parker has. But then I think they take it even further. And I wanted to make it where he's not just like the snarky kid. In fact, most of the time we get the snark kind of from his friends rather than from him. But I wanted to make him like just a very relatable kid and have a relatable voice where like at times he's super confident, maybe more confident than he should be. And then at other times he's like, a deer in the headlights, like, what am I doing? Like, how can I get out of this? Like, why am I here? Why did I ever think I was up to this challenge? So that's kind of the pendulum swing of the voice with Miles. And then just, make it fun. Honestly, the thing about graphic novels, and especially for young readers, is that I know that for some readers, this might be like their first real crack at writing. And so I want to make sure that they have an opportunity to enjoy the process. And hopefully it kind of opens the way for them to read even more graphic novels and comics and whatever else down the line. So yeah, I just thought about what's fun, what's exciting, and what seems current and relevant to what kids are going through today.
Aside from Miles Morales and the two villains, were there any other characters that you were particularly excited to write from this universe?
Mm. I there's a couple of characters. There's one character who I want to name, but I don't want to name him because I am really hoping that they let me write him. It's something I've been kind of pushing for behind the scenes for a little bit. And so I won't say that character, but I'll say that like I um I don't think there's anyone in the Marvel world that I wouldn't want to write. Yeah, I think for me, if I had to choose, I would love to do Blue Marvel. Um, it's a little known character in the universe. Doesn't really get as much play as a lot of the other characters, and I think probably because the level of power is like almost it was like almost infinitesimal. It's like we created somebody who like almost doesn't have any weaknesses, and so how do you create a villain or a situation that would put them actually at a challenge? And like I think that's the kind of challenge that I embrace though. It's like trying to find and create a story for like something that feels like it's almost impossible to create. And then honestly, you mentioned earlier your like love for like Iron Man. And I love Iron Man for the same reasons I love Spider-Man, except for like Iron Man is a grown-up version of Spider-Man and it's just a regular person. And so I think that's the part where it's like on one hand, I know as I've gotten older, people are like, people like Iron Man or Batman or like whatever, those kind of guys who are like kind of their own vigilantes and they kind of go out and like do their own thing and they have all this money to spend at their disposal. And people are like, why don't they just save the world with all that money they have instead of doing suits and trying to like be cool, go out in the night and like, protect the city? Why don't they just like, I don't know, buy more food for people and things, which, fair point. But I think what is interesting about them is that, you know, it is a choice that they're making and they are mortals and they're putting themselves kind of in harm's way. And, it's easy just to be a billionaire and sit back on your laurels and enjoy the fruits of your labor or the fruits of other people's labor. But I think the fact that he chooses to speak up and chooses to try to make a difference time and time again does often speak to his character at heart. He wouldn't want you to be sentimental or sappy about who he is. But I think it's clear to anyone who's a fan of Iron Man that he definitely has a great heart on and off the page.
Yeah, back whenever I still had my vendetta against Spider-Man, I had one friend who was like the biggest Spider-Man fan, and he was always trying to convince me this is the hero for you. And I'm like, I kept saying the difference is Iron Man and Batman by extension are, like you said, just regular people. They chose to do this. They didn't have superpowers, and his one line was, "Wealth is a superpower." And I was like, "You're right. You got me. I'll consider
It
Spider-Man
is.
again."
It is. It's crazy because it's like, like like even like his the costumes and stuff that Spider-Man has to get. It's like you're like getting from other people. Like you don't have at your disposal. Oh, let me just go and create this super suit that has this and that. Imagine if he had that type of power. And with the Avengers, he kind of does in a way. And so it's just like, yeah, you um on one hand are deciding as Iron Man to go out there and do something that no one really asked you to do with your money. Versus, I think, like you said, to the point that really endears Miles to me is that Miles just happened to kind of stumble into the situation, and he could have kept it a secret and decided to like not do anything with the power. He could have decided, like I said, to be a bad guy, but instead, every day he wakes up like, how can I be the best version of me, and how can I do the most good for the most amount of people? And I think that in itself is heroic.
I'm curious, because these movies, the animated movies across the Spider-Verse, like they're huge out there. I wonder, having written Miles Morales, do you see the movies differently at all, or do you still appreciate them as they were? Do you feel like, oh yeah, that I know this character well, I wrote him. Like, what's your reaction to these movies, and has it changed since you started writing him?
It's wild because I love so much, especially what the first movie did, to like really invigorate the current fan base, but also to like bring so many new fans to the table who fell in love with Spider-Man. And like I said, the idea that Miles Morales is their first Spider-Man is such an awesome uh, thing to experience and to witness. Like how they're kind of growing, these kids are kind of growing with Miles, and just to be a part of that and have being able to have written a couple stories that help uh, create that legacy that Miles has been building has been amazing. And I think that what's really cool about those movies is that they do a fantastic job of transcending the character. In fact, I like, a lot of times I'm like, I kind of cringe when I think about the movies, period. And like any movie that's being adapted from a book or a graphic novel or a comic, because you're just like, there's so many elements that just can't make their way onto the screen. It's just
Mm.
impossible. Physically can't happen. And yet, when you look at like the amount of heart and love that they put into the Across the Spider Verse and into the Spider Verse, it's literally amazing. I mean, those stories aren't good animated movies; those are great movies. And that's the thing about it. It's like I can't wait for the second half to come out. Like I'm gonna be there. I went there last time with my Miles Morales um, costume on, so I'm gonna do that again. Like I can't wait to go and hang out there. And yeah, those movies are great because they really also drew so many people to the comics, and so many kids were like, "Wow, I didn't even know that Miles Morales was a thing," and now they're falling in love with him through reading those comics and graphic novels the same way that I did.
Yeah. No, those movies, like, I'm glad you said it's not just a great animated movie. It's not just a great superhero movie, just a great movie. And there are so many
Mhm.
people who, are quick to discount superheroes or animation, yet those people enjoy the movie. There's just, and not to say, one art has more value in it, but the artistic quality of that movie is just on another level. And
It is
it's
top notch.
gorgeous.
The storytelling, the beauty of that. So I mean, like that's a story that I can a movie I can watch over and over again, and it doesn't get old. I see new things that I appreciate. The way that they really went to kind of unite also the old fans of like Peter Parker and bringing this new fan group in with Miles Morales and the respect that they give to both characters, kind of in this two-hander, or if you will, is so amazing and so authentic. You could tell that this was a labor of love. I know that it kind of got delayed a little bit, and people were like, "What's going on? What's going on?" But it was worth it because the amount of time and care that they put into that film was evident for all to see. And I think honestly, the biggest disappointment to me regarding the film was that it didn't win Best Picture of the Year because it was by far to me the best.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, it was the first art book I ever bought. I've always loved art books, but the price has always been so
Exactly. Yeah.
obstructive. But the Across the Spider-Verse art book was the first one I ever got. That playlist has made it onto the soundtrack has made it onto every playlist I ever make. So it's like
Yes.
just hitting on so many different levels. I would just want to like always have something connected to that storytelling universe. It's remarkable. Um, so before we wrap it up, anything else I haven't asked that you want to throw out there? Anything you want to mention before we wrap this up?
I just think that the one thing I would want to say is I started the kind of the interview talking about my mom and how she used to take us to the flea market for those comics. And my mom, the thing I didn't mention was that she was an educator and a librarian. She retired as a librarian a few years back. And what's cool about her is that she never tried to make me feel like reading comics was less than. It wasn't like, oh, here, compare to this book here, or read this book here, or read this the U.S. canon on this. She, of course, she wanted me to read books of all sorts, but she never made me feel like somehow by choosing to read a comic or pick up a graphic novel, I was making a lesser choice. And because of that, it really did infuse my love for writing, but also especially for reading. And to this day, I continue to read comics and I share comics with young people and old people because comics are such a great way to tell a story. And the skills that you have, even as I have as a novelist compared to the skills that it takes to write a graphic novel are so different that it really challenges you and pushes you. And I can truly say that now I haven't been on both sides as a reader and a writer of graphic novels. I have such a profound respect for people who write those and who create the art for those because it's a daunting task. But of course, with the right team behind you, it makes it a lot easier. I think that's kind of what you learn. It's like just like superheroes kind of have to sometimes rally together. In writing these books, I kind of had to rally together with the superhero team. But it started with my mom and her kind of giving me permission to love those books. And I always tell kids, and I tell parents and teachers and educators, I don't care if it's inside of a cereal box. If a kid wants to read something, please allow them to read it. Let them ignite their passion for reading and for learning and for growing. And then the rest will take care of itself.
That is such a good note to end on because I still hear it today where people say, okay, you can read comics, but you got to read real books too. And I'm like,
Exactly. Exactly.
ugh,
Exactly. Comics are real books, people. Comics are real books.
they are. They are. All right. Well, Justin, thank you so much again for joining for this. This was awesome. I really appreciate you taking the time.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, Josh. I appreciate it. It was awesome.
All right.